Right, so it's been a little while since I did one of these off-topic videos, and to be honest, normally when I'm doing something with computers, I don't really spend a lot of time producing the video. I just normally throw a camera in the corner, do a time lapse, and then put a few bits of text in along the way. Now, I've had my late 2015 iMac for a little while now, and when I first got it, I decided to up the specs because I was absolutely gobsmacked at how poorly it performed compared to my previous bigger iMac, thicker iMac. This was the first one of the thinner iMacs that I'd had, and I was pretty gutted really, because I thought I can't upgrade this thing, and this is what I've got. Now, what I then did was I got a i7 6700K processor out of another PC, put a 2 terabyte hard drive, SSD hard drive in, and then I also added a 512 gigabyte Western Digital Black NVMe drive with an adapter for the iMac. And the performance difference has been incredible, and it's still a really fast machine. It's absolute beast. I'm still really happy with it. However, one of my friends sold me this. It's a 2019 iMac. It's the base model with the 8th gen i5 processor and a 1 terabyte Fusion drive. Now actually it's not too bad, but I think we better give this the same treatment as I gave the 2015 iMac. So what we're going to do to this thing is we're going to put in an i9 9900K F processor, a 1 terabyte Western Digital Black NVMe drive, a 2 terabyte SSD from Crucial, and we're going to upgrade the memory to 32 gigs. It's currently running 16, and we're going to use 2 DIMMs to do that, so we've got a maximum of 64 gigs with the 4 slots. Now, this iMac here is about £1,700, $1,700 new. The only reason my friend sold me this is actually because it went away for a warranty repair, but due to the lockdown situation here in the UK, it took over 2 months to get repaired, and in the meantime he bought another one. So I've got this one. He also gave me a great deal on it. I picked it up for £1,000, which is super cheap. If I can do this upgrade without breaking anything, I'll have got myself a steal of a Mac. If I break it, then I took the risk. And that's the thing. That's the reason I don't normally do really in-depth detailed tutorial type videos for this kind of thing, because it is silly easy to break these things if you don't know what you're doing, or if you hadn't had the experience, or if you put a little foot wrong. You can do one of a number of things. A, you can break the screen just by trying to take it off. There are some really great tools that make it a lot easier, like the little cutter wheels, but it's still a risk. And you can electrostatically destroy some of the electrical components when you're handling the motherboard, for example, or the CPU or the NVMe drives. You can crush the processor by installing the cooler incorrectly when replacing the CPU. So for all of these reasons, I'll say what I normally say at the start of one of these videos, which is don't do it. But anyway, I'm going to take the risk. Stick along, let's get the time lapse going, let's see how we get on. Right, so now we've got the screen off, probably time to take a break, celebrate that you haven't broken it with your favourite caffeinated beverage, and then we can get on with taking out all of the bits and pieces. Once the screen's off, it's pretty much like any other PC, except it's really neat. A bit of a work of art, really. So it's a shame they don't let you get into these a little bit more easily. So what we've got here is the speakers either side. This is new. These things have got to come out before we can take the motherboard out. You've got the main motherboard or logic board, power supply, hard drive. The NVMe drive is underneath underneath here. There's a few things that we've got to take off. So we've got to take we've got to take everything off. But the order's pretty critical. So we start with the speakers. This speaker has a wire hidden underneath here. We will then take off the fan. We will take off the Wi-Fi antenna. There's some connectors dotted around the board. There's also a connector, the main power connector underneath there. Then we'll go into the hard drive. We'll take the hard drive case off, and then we'll pull the motherboard out once we've got the power supply out, and then that will let us get to the other side of this CPU, and we'll need to take the CPU cooler off, which is also the graphics GPU cooler as well, and then we can go and start putting the new bits in. So that's what we're going to do. Right, there we go. So we have the motherboard out of the machine and it's on the desk ready to get some upgrades. So as you can see, this is the motherboard. Got my anti-static device and my mat here. And we have all the ports on the back. Just change hands on that. So we've got all the ports on the back. We've got the stock 28 gigabyte flash drive. And that's the big problem with this machine, is that with this drive, as soon as this gets full, you're back to a hard drive, a spinning disk, which will be really, really slow. We've got 4 sticks of RAM. We're going to upgrade that. I haven't got a full complement because we can always upgrade this RAM anytime we like. We don't have to dig into the machine because there's a door on the back. And then underneath here is the CPU, but we need to take the cooler off of the CPU and the GPU, and then we've got some of this MX4 somewhere. MX4 thermal compound. Make sure you get lots of this because there's lots of chips under here that also need this thermal compound, so you don't want to run out of that halfway through the job. And then everything can start going back together once we've done that. So let's get on with upgrading this board. Right, now everything's out, the cooler's off, the chip's out. Now we've just got to clean up all of the contacts, points on there. So there's a copper contact point for the chip and the GPU, but also the memory that sits around the GPU. So we've now got to clean all of that off, and then we can put it all back together and we can get the i9 in there. I really don't like this bit. The spring for the cooler retention on the i9 processor is really, really tight, and the motherboard on these iMacs has no retainer for the CPU, so the only thing that's keeping it in place is the cooling block, and it could be very easy when you flip it over to do the screws up for the CPU to move slightly, and then essentially you'd then be crushing the CPU onto the plastic chip piece. So this is my least favorite bit of the whole thing, and it's one of the reasons I don't recommend anyone do this ever. wasn't going to plan. I bent some pins on the motherboard because I noticed that the heatsink wasn't making contact with the memory chip pins, so I took it off again, having put it on perfectly, and then when I went to put it on again, the cooler came away, which pulled the CPU off, and that's bent some pins as the CPU kind of scraped along the socket. So I'm just going to try and bend the pins back so that we can recover this situation, but it's a bit tense right now. Well, that was even more horrible than the last one of these I did. But we got the pins bent back just about. There is a little bit of give in the pins. The pads are quite big on the chip, so there's also a possibility that some of the pins wouldn't actually be required anyway. So it's always worth putting it back together. Don't throw your toys out of the pram. Don't chuck the motherboard across the room. Don't shred the CPU. It's probably going to be okay. It's just a little bit tense whilst you assess the damage to the board. But this is one of the reasons why I really don't like changing the CPUs in these iMacs, because normally the CPU is retained by a metal clamp, and for space reasons Apple have decided to do away with that on these motherboards, so it's purely held in by the cooler itself, and the screws are on the other side of the motherboard, so you have to flip it whilst everything is loose. I have found that you can remove the RAM shroud, which is just a piece of plastic. That makes accessing and changing the CPU a lot easier, and bending the pins back a lot easier. It's held in by 3 screws and also a little piece of adhesive, but the 3 screws will do a fine job. The adhesive's really just a bit of an extra. So we'll crack on and get this thing finished. So new day, because Amazon didn't send me this, and so I couldn't go any further with the build until I had it. This is an NVMe to the Apple proprietary connector. Now, so one of the things about these is that a lot of people say that they don't work, or they have problems when they fit them. And if you look at the wires, the little traces, as they go into this block here, they actually go up. And what that can do is that can actually connect with the metal housing on the motherboard and actually short these pins out across all of these pins, and of course it's not going to work then. So unless you want to take your Mac apart all over again, I put some of this Captain tape on the front side that connects into the motherboard, so that there's no chance of an electrical connection being shorted out. So this Captain tape's great stuff for that. You can get it off online, Amazon, wherever. But yeah, use that because then you won't have to take your Mac apart again if it shorts out. Right, so that's the screen on. Obviously I'm not going to put the adhesive on until I know this thing works, so hence all of the masking tape that's gone onto this. I've also put a cushion of masking tape underneath the screen because normally the screen would be sitting on the foam padding that is in between those two sticky layers. So what I don't want to do is put the screen directly on the metal. It could scratch some of the paint that sits on the back of the screen, and then you'd see that coming through in the outside. So there's a cushion of masking tape around, then the screen is on, and then the screen has been taped so that the screen doesn't fall away. But if there is anything wrong, if I've missed a connection, or if the pins are still bent and there's a chance of salvaging this thing, then at least I can go back in very quickly. And if it all doesn't work, I have to go back in anyway and take some of the stuff out because I can sell it or use it in other computers that I have around here. This is fantastic. It's booting to an extent. It's obviously not booting into the operating system, but it means that my fix has worked mostly. We won't know if the fix is a complete success until we look at things like the memory and the stability of the system. We might see things like memory modules missing, or in fact we might see that when we put a memory module into a particular slot, the system crashes. I've left the 16 gigabytes in because that takes up all 4 slots in the board. If I'd have put the 32 gig in the 2 modules that I've got in, if I then upgraded in the future and found that the 64 gig option crashed the machine, or it didn't boot with that in, it would probably be because a pin was still bent, but it was only being used when those extra RAM modules were actually in the slot. So it's really good to have those 4 slots filled just to make sure that it can address all the RAM properly. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to have a celebratory drink of ice water. Then I'm going to download onto a stick an operating system, and then we can throw macOS on, boot it up, and see what's actually going on with this machine. But so far it looks good. I'm really happy, but it just goes to show when you're doing an operation like this, you are putting it all on the line. Now I've been playing around with this Mac for a couple of days now just to check it's stable, and it's very stable. In fact, one of the really great things about this one is that it looks like the drivers and the motherboard are more compatible with the NVMe drive, because if you watched my video on the 2015 build where I put a 6700K and a 500 gigabyte NVMe drive and a 2 terabyte SSD, in that one it had trouble hibernating. I'm really pleased to say that this 2019 version doesn't have that problem, and it does hibernate without any problems at all. I don't know if that's just this particular model, but it's working on here, so I'm really happy about that. Let's just have a look at how much money it would have cost us to get near this spec from Apple, and let's have a look at what it actually cost me to do this job. As you know, this was the base model 3 GHz i5 processor. Now with that model you couldn't actually spec the i9 chip in here, so you had to go for at least the middle of the road spec before you got that. Now there is a difference between the middle of the road and the base spec in terms of the graphics card, so we're not going to get exactly the same spec, but I think you'll see as we start to spec this one up, you'll realise that even when we spec it up, we can't even get close to the storage options that we've got on here. So we'll select that one. Base price is £1,900. We then spec up the 9th generation processor, which is £500. That's not a bad deal if you were just buying the processor, but remember you're now not buying the 6-core 8th gen processor, so really it's a hell of a markup there. We've got the 64 gigs of RAM in here, and on Apple they will charge you £1,000 for that, so we're already up to £3,500. Now with that still gives you only a 1 terabyte Fusion drive, which I think means you'll get a 1 terabyte hard drive and then the same 28 gig SSD NVMe type M.2 drive that this one had. So that's exactly the same as what we had in this one, which is absolutely scandalous. Now they don't do a 3 terabyte option, so we've got 3 terabytes of storage in here across the NVMe drive and the SSD. So the best that we can do is we can spec up a 3 terabyte Fusion drive, which again I suspect will just be a 3 terabyte drive with a 28 gig NVMe M.2 type drive in there as well. So with all of that in place, the total cost of this Mac is £3,749. Now let's have a look at what we spent. This Mac was second hand off my friend. It broke during lockdown. He couldn't get it fixed. The power supply was damaged. He waited a couple of months before the lockdown started to ease, but because he was so desperate for a machine, he actually bought a new Mac to tide him over. And when it was eventually repaired, he sold it to me for £1,000, which was a great deal. He did keep the keyboard and mouse from it because he actually bought a Mac Mini and he needed those accessories, but I didn't mind because I'd already got those accessories. So I paid £1,000 for that machine. Now I then spent £177 on the 1 terabyte NVMe card, £17.99 on the adapter, £9.99 on a drive tray adapter for the 3.5 down to 2.5 for the SSD drive. I got some MX4 paste for the heat sinks. I spent a bit more than I needed to, but I wanted to have a big syringe of that because I thought I would have to remove it a couple of times, and I did. I spent £206 on the Crucial SSD. That's a lot more than I spent on my last one. I got my last one on a Black Friday or a Prime Day at £150, so that was a little bit more expensive than I paid for it last time. Then I spent £473 on the i9 9900KF processor. I got the KF processor because that's what's actually fitted to the Macs. It doesn't have the graphics. It seems to run a bit cooler from all of the research that I've done online, looking at what people are doing in the overclocking community. Then I eventually maxed it out to 64 gigabytes. I'm not going to do 128 gigabytes. The cost difference between 128 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of RAM is ridiculous, and I don't think I'll actually ever get to using 64 gigs of RAM. So I'm quite happy with going for the 64 gigs of RAM, and that was £231. Bearing in mind, £231 versus £1,000 from Apple. That is a ridiculous markup. And especially as it's something you can change yourself. You don't even have to take anything apart. You just literally open up the back door and you can put the RAM slots. The RAM slots are right there. So all in all, on the modifications, we spent £1,134.52. That takes our total to £2,134. So for £2,134, we got a machine that is better than you can buy from Apple for £3,750. That is a big saving. In fact, it's so much of a saving, you could almost buy another base model for the difference. It's huge. However, what I will say, and I say it in every one of these videos, don't do it. It's potentially something that could ruin a really expensive computer. I really nearly did it, but you know, I took the risk, I sorted it out, I kept my cool, I put the pins back in the right place, and she's golden. Now, if you don't fancy taking the risk, but you do fancy having a machine like this, one of the things I have seen is that I'm not the first person to realise that there's a huge saving to be made if you do this themselves. And I've found, at least here in the UK, at least one company that is providing this service with a warranty. So you can go and get a iMac that's already had some of this work done. Admittedly, mostly they just do the processors, but I'm guessing if you gave them a call and said, can you put an NVMe drive in and an SSD, they probably would. And they're charging a lot less money than Apple. I think they're charging about £2,800 for an i9 version of this iMac. And basically all they're doing is they're buying them straight off Apple, they're ripping them apart, they're putting the chip in, and they're probably making a bit of money on the side selling the other chips. And that's another thing. What we haven't taken into account here is I've still got a pile of stuff. So I've still got the i5 8500 chip, I've got 16 gigabytes of RAM. That's not going to make me much money, but the chip will, and that's going to probably actually go into my gaming PC, and I'll upgrade that a little bit. So all in all, this is probably not the extent of the savings. I'm probably going to save myself 200, maybe £200 in terms of the CPU. So, you could say that actually after those savings, we've spent about £900 all in. Might get £30 for the RAM as well. Not a huge amount there because Apple is still putting 8 gigs of RAM, and no one really wants 4 gigabyte DIMMs anymore. So anyway, this is a little bit different from the kind of videos I normally do, but when I upgrade my gear to make the videos for my kind of main part of my channel, then I always put a little bit of a time lapse on it. But I was so blown away by the number of people that responded to my previous one, I thought I'd just put a bit of extra effort into this video. Now you'll notice that she's still wearing the bandages from her operation. That is because currently the glue, the new strips are still on their way from wherever it is they're coming from. I'm guessing with everything that's going on in the world, these kind of things are perhaps not quite in the supply chain situation that they otherwise would be. So I'm waiting a little bit longer to finish it off, but it's giving me a good chance to give it a run and check everything's working. Anyway, if you thought this was good fun, give it a like. If you thought this was absolute heresy, well, sorry, but actually I really like working on these Apple computers. I think they're really beautiful machines, and they're beautiful on the inside as well as on the outside. I just wish Apple would make them more accessible for people to tinker with, because actually I think it's one of the things that I grew up doing, making computers. It's what made me want to get into computers and working with computers as a career. And I think Apple are doing people a real disservice by shutting things away too much, because it's not going to inspire the next generation of people who want to work with this technology. So ultimately, that's going to come back and hurt them too. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to like it. I wouldn't really subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, because I don't do it very often. But when I do, I'll put it up there. You can always subscribe just in case I do another one. But with Intel chips going out of Mac soon, I'm pretty sure this is probably the last Mac I'll be upgrading, because I'll bet you when they go to ARM, they'll be soldered right onto the board, and you won't be able to go out and buy an ARM chip anyway, because Apple will be holding on to them very closely indeed. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time maybe.